Thanks in part to the global financial meltdown, we now know what a black swan is. But do we know from which direction the next one will swim into view, or what to do when it does? Black swans are, of course, those highly improbable but painfully consequential events that can strike from the blue. In recent years, they have emanated from the streets of Cairo, from an offshore oil rig, and from a poorly designed car part. The bad news is that these events can destroy a company's reputation, cripple its financial performance, and perhaps even kill it outright. And worse, because they are rare and almost impossible to predict, black swan events tend to fall outside the scope of most companies' risk management programs. The good news comes from proponents of enterprise risk management, a decade-old integrated approach known as ERM, to managing a broad spectrum of risks. In contrast to the once common siloed approach to risk management, ERM offers a holistic methodology for identifying, assessing, quantifying, and addressing strategic, operational, market, financial, and human risks in order to optimize the risk-return profile. The new level of acceptance and maturity of ERM stems from the confluence of several recent trends. First, corporate boards are under increased regulatory pressure to address risk management explicitly. Second, new technologies are enhancing companies' ability to evaluate, measure, and prioritize risks. And third, the issuance of COSO's latest thought leadership paper on ERM. After all, before a company can claim to have an effective risk management process, it must be able to identify or define its appetite for risk, yet many companies struggle on that point. That inspired the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, known as COSO, to develop a thought leadership paper to help companies in understanding and communicating risk appetite. In this recently issued paper, COSO defines risk appetite as the amount of risk that an organization is willing to accept in its pursuit of value.
Returning to our program is John McLaughlin, a partner as well as the Risk Advisory Services Leader for BDO USA. Thanks for joining us again, John.
It's great to be back, Becky.
Now, we've certainly heard a lot in recent years about enterprise risk management. Let me start with a baseline question for you. What is ERM anyway?
That's a great question, Becky. So there's a definition to ERM, and that definition involves things such as that it's a process that's affected by a board and management and other constituents, other members of the organization, to evaluate events that can occur in the strategy setting process, and evaluating those events in the context of risk management and what actions need to be done to mitigate those risks, all with the spirit of at least trying to give some reasonable assurance that those objectives of the organization can be achieved. I'll give it in a shorter way, is that bad things happen, is that human nature is such that just bad things will continue to happen, and organizations need to take measures at least to either avoid those bad things or perhaps to manage those bad things when they occur.
Well, that makes sense, but tell me, John, why are we hearing so much about ERM right now? Is it just the flavor of the month?
Well, I wouldn't say it's the flavor of the month. I think what's happening is that, over the past 10 years or so, ERM was a concept that was created out of COSO and the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. In 2004, they created a framework because of Enron and WorldCom and Adelphia. And now we see, a few years later, the financial crisis that occurred. And now we see even events such as the BP oil disaster, the JP Morgan issue, the Penn State abuse scandal, and even now Motiva and its refinery in Port Arthur, Texas, and what's happening there. And so people are beginning to evaluate risk, and when they see these more recent events like BP and Penn State and Motiva, I think boards and management are saying this is cutting closer to home here. It's becoming less theory and more an actual thing. And I think many of these executives and these board members are saying, not on my watch, not at my company. So it's once again raising in its importance with companies.
I know our viewers like and are accustomed to the notion of frameworks. At one time, John, you told me and our viewers about COSO's so-called integrated framework for ERM. Is that still considered up to date?
So, Becky, you'll recall we just spoke a few months ago about the exposure draft related to COSO and the internal control framework, and that within that exposure draft, COSO has expanded the risk assessment section to contain a few principles. And so there are questions out there right now about what happens with the old ERM, with the ERM framework, and whether it's still relevant.
Well, that makes sense, John, but to what extent have other frameworks also emerged in this area?
There are other frameworks, and for instance, the Open Compliance and Ethics Group, or OSEG as they're called, they've created a framework as well. Their view is a little different than an ERM in such that it's evaluating governance, risk, and control, GRC, and that acronym. And so they've created a framework called the Red Book. And the Red Book looks at governance, risk, and control in a different light, a slightly different light, some of the concepts being the same. But the practices and methodologies that are in their framework evaluate things such as values and codes of conduct and ethics hotlines and things of that nature. So it's a bit more granular than maybe the principles-based approach that COSO has. I think if you read it, you'd find actually it's a very good read and a very useful document.
Yes, the corporate environment is certainly full of risks, but with all the attention that's being paid to risk management and decision-making, do you get the feeling, based on your practice in risk advisory services, that there's a basic understanding of ERM in business today?
Well, actually, when we're executing projects for companies and helping them establish ERM programs, one of the things that we start with is that we're polling people, executives within the organization. We'll poll even more than just the executives, but we're asking some baseline questions. But we'll ask the question, do you understand the basic concepts of ERM? And invariably, people will answer yes, or in the affirmative, and saying that they understand it. And then we'll ask a similar question following that about the organization, and does the organization understand it and embrace it? And invariably, the answer is no, or it's the negative. So it's kind of funny to see that the disparity in the answer. And what we're trying to do is to close that disparity and that gap in helping companies establish these programs over time.
In most cases, management selects a risk response strategy. I assume that that means that they're going to try to avoid or at least reduce the risk. But aren't there times, John, when management makes a decision just to accept a risk?
There are often they do accept the risk, and that shouldn't be confused with necessarily ignoring the risk. So there's a process that management needs to go through in evaluating its objectives and its goals and the risks to achieving those goals and objectives. And those questions involve cost, the energy of the organization, the talent within the organization, the cost of insurance, the cost of controls and additional processes and technologies. And so companies have to go through that process and may come to the decision that they can't afford it and that maybe they just have to live with that risk or accept that risk. But again, it shouldn't be confused with ignoring the risk, because many companies do ignore risks and believe that actually that is ultimately an acceptance of risk. So it's a dangerous place to be in.
Well, it's interesting that you use the phrase risk appetite, John, because I saw a recent thought leadership document from COSO on understanding and communicating risk appetite. I'm curious, do organizations on a broad level actually decide the amount of risk they're willing to take in pursuit of value, or are those just words that appear on studies by consultants and think tanks?
Well, companies should be going through the exercise to evaluate their risk appetite and actually risk tolerances as well. But many companies may not actually go through that exercise because it's arduous. It's time-consuming and it's difficult. At least the first time it's difficult. So there's a discussion about risk at every board meeting. Certainly it's promulgated by the SEC that disclosures about risk need to take place within the proxy. But there also has to be a culture and an acceptance of risk throughout the organization. And that's where maybe there is a disparity between at least the actions of evaluating risk and ultimately creating programs around risk management within an organization. It's not until an organization really accepts that they need to create a program and a methodology and an approach to risk management that they will actually expend the resources and the time and the energy in creating effective enterprise risk management programs. So a company, in order to get started, should really think big but start small. And what I mean by that is make a small investment in getting started, in evaluating those key risks within the organization, and having a healthy discussion about what is the risk appetite of the organization and trying to get a fix on that risk appetite.
Oh, that's a great observation, John. Can you give me an example from the real world?
So I've got a client. It's a life sciences company, and they're concerned about supply chain. And not only just with the active ingredient and obtaining the active ingredient as part of the supply chain, but also with redundancies in their systems and their processes. And so what they're evaluating is where can we obtain the active ingredient elsewhere in case of a blip, but also, what is the cost involved in terms of people and policies and technologies in creating some redundant or failover systems. So this company is at a crossroads where it's saying to itself, can I afford the technologies? Can I afford to create other vendor relationships for this active ingredient? Can I, maybe not, and can I afford insurance related to a lapse in the supply chain? And so with those questions comes the notion, do I accept the risk or do I manage the risk, and what is the cost associated with that risk?
It's interesting that your example involves a company's supply chain. There are a number of complex risks embedded in the supply chain, aren't there?
Risk management is dealing with very complicated business problems. So if you look at supply chain, for instance, you're looking at the risks of the weather, the risks of political instability, the risks of the European crisis, the risks of devaluing currencies. There are many, many risks that go into just the risk of supply chain. And it's a process of peeling the onion and making sure that you can evaluate all the different events that go into a particular risk and evaluating what you would do about those events. The geopolitical risk creates a number of other new permutations in companies evaluating their risk environment. Going international, having shared services environments 12 time zones away, different business cultures, recognized practices within some countries as being completely legitimate, yet in other countries, such as the United States or the UK, being against the law, as in the case with FCPA and the UK Bribery Act. So as companies expand on the international scale, they're finding that their risk portfolio, the potential for risks, has expanded significantly.
You're right, John. Investors and regulators are increasingly interested in disclosure of risk management processes. In fact, I think I've even seen rating agencies use a company's articulation of its risk governance as one of their evaluation tools.
So rating agencies are very interested in risk management, as are insurance underwriters and as are the regulators as well. They all have a keen interest in what the organization is thinking about how they're managing the risks, because these are stakeholders, the rating agencies, the regulators, the insurance underwriters, and other people have a stake in that. So they want to know. To your point about the rating agencies, I am aware of rating agencies that at least want to know for an adequate rating is that there is a risk appetite that's been articulated by an organization. So there is some effort that's required to do so, and rating agencies recognize a value in that.
Well, on one hand, John, you emphasize that ERM is not about compliance. But on the other hand, how can you ensure that all of your units are operating within bounds that represent the organization's appetite for specific kinds of risks?
So I think, actually, Becky, that is the question here, because you can have a board and senior management evaluate risk and create a risk appetite, but ultimately what they need to do is communicate that risk appetite to the troops, to the people within the organization, and set boundaries, and those boundaries being reflected in risk tolerances of the organization.
Thanks, John. We'll return to your commentary in a minute.
You've probably seen widespread media coverage about a scathing report that excoriated top Pennsylvania State University officials, including legendary football coach Joe Paterno, for failing to protect boys from a sexual predator. The 267-page report, commissioned by university trustees after allegations surfaced about abuse by former assistant football coach Jerry Sandusky, said top Penn State officials, including former President Graham Spanier and the late Coach Paterno, failed to, quote, protect against a child sexual predator harming children for over a decade, end quote. The report, prepared by former Federal Bureau of Investigation Director Louis Freeh, indicated that, one, Penn State had a lax reporting system for crimes or suspected crimes, and two, university officials made decisions designed to protect its revered and highly profitable football program. But to what extent is this a warning to other organizations about the amount of risk they are willing to accept?
At one point, John, you provided us with a risk analysis of the events that occurred in 1984 at Union Carbide's plant in Bhopal, India. And I'm certain that many case studies are being prepared right now about the risk strategy employed by JP Chase in connection with its recent trading losses. Is it possible to apply the same analysis and the same risk factors to a different type of tragedy, the sex abuse scandal associated with the football program at Penn State University?
Oh, I believe absolutely it is. In fact, these risk factors can be applied to just about any kind of a situation. So when I read the news, I'm reading about the BP oil disaster, and I'm reading about Penn State and the sex abuse scandal, and I'm reading about JP Chase and the $2 or $5 billion loss. I'm even applying it to small instances like a tragedy that happened at a local swim club. I mean, it's amazing that there's no shortage of human nature and that these things do occur. And it's worthwhile to recognize these risk factors in evaluating all these events and helping your company manage itself better. Penn State didn't see it coming, and other organizations necessarily didn't see it coming. So there has to be a resiliency of these programs and a culture that accepts the fact that this is a project that won't end. But you have to continue to monitor these programs to make sure that it's effectively mitigating those risks that are out there.
Viewers may be familiar with the work on operational risk management by Mark Apkowitz, a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Vanderbilt University. Through a detailed analysis of natural disasters, man-made accidents, and terrorist acts, from devastating tsunamis to major oil spills, Professor Apkowitz identifies the 10 basic risk factors that underlie various catastrophes. 1. Design and construction flaws. 2. Deferred maintenance. 3. Economic pressures. 4. Schedule constraints. 5. Inadequate training. 6. Not following procedures. 7. Lack of planning and preparedness. 8. Communication failure. 9. Arrogance. And 10. Political agendas.
It makes sense to me, John, that those 10 risk factors developed by a professor of civil and environmental engineering could be applied to the gas leak disaster at Bhopal or the oil spill from the Exxon Valdez. But how do you apply those risk factors to the sex abuse scandal at Penn State? I mean, for instance, what is the design flaw?
Well, actually, the design flaw in the case with Penn State, in my view, is that Paterno, so Joe Paterno was in his 80s, and he's coaching this major football program, and the guy was an institution for sure. I had the great fortune, by the way, of going to a Penn State game. It would happen to be Paterno's 400th victory. And I'm sitting across the sidelines on the 35-yard line watching the game with my son Jack, who's 9 at the time. And Paterno's standing there on the sidelines, and no one's standing within 5 yards of either side of Paterno on this crowded sideline. He clearly wasn't coaching the team. He's looking at the ground, he's looking at the game, but he's not the coach. And so the question is, was he too old to coach? And certainly he had a great track record, and we saw a great game that day. But in his 80s, Penn State and perhaps the board had already questioned. In fact, it seems to be clear that maybe they were questioning his ability to run that major football program. So in my view, there's the design flaw.
Well, sometimes an organization has a risk appetite for a known risk. The classic example is the mining company that accepts the fact that it must pay fines to regulatory agencies. But if those fines represent safety violations, does the company also have a risk appetite for a potential mining disaster? In the Penn State case, I suppose the university trustees and the athletic director knew that their coach was no longer capable of actively leading the football program. But I guess the question is, do they also have a risk appetite for the power that his incapacity bestowed on his assistant coaches and others?
Well, there's two things you're mentioning there. So that example about the mining company, Becky, is actually provided in COSO's white paper about risk appetite. And they're providing an excellent example there where the mining company decided that they would pay fines as opposed to the cost of paying the fines was less than paying for the remediation activities of making the mine safer. Unfortunately, they didn't think through the permutations that the mine was not safe, and it ultimately resulted in the tragedy and the loss of the lives of many miners in West Virginia and mines throughout the world. The issue with Penn State is that perhaps the board and certainly senior management had not really evaluated the permutations there of the football program and the risks that relate to perhaps the design flaw of Joe Paterno being too old and making that judgment. He clearly had indicated before he died that he made mistakes, and he admitted that. But the board and management should be evaluating that and saying, are there greater risks at stake here, and what are we doing about those risks?
In a similar vein, I assume that design flaw was not the only risk factor that was present at Penn State. Do you want to elaborate on some of them for us, John?
Sure, there are others. So as Apka has pointed out, these 10 risk factors, if you look at Penn State, clearly there was a communication issue. Who said what to whom and when? You've got the local police, you've got the state police, the state attorney general, the administration. There seemed to be a lot of he said, she said type of a thing there. So the other implications may have been that Joe Paterno was an institution, and maybe there was a communication issue between the younger coaches and Joe Paterno, and going around Joe Paterno because he was so revered, and speaking with the administration. So, one of the assistant coaches who had actually seen Jerry Sandusky took it to the coach. Coach took it up the flagpole to another more senior member of management. But maybe it was that coach, that assistant coach, who should have bypassed Joe Paterno. But he couldn't, because Joe Paterno was such a strong fixture within that organization. Not following procedures is another one. For instance, the assistant coach had seen something. When you see something, you should say something. And training, again, seeing something and saying something is were the staff appropriately trained to respond to a situation like this? Apparently not. So you can apply several of these factors with Penn State, and it's apparent that this can be applied to many situations, as you asked before. Certainly the economic constraints and the power of the football program and its dominance in the university itself. When it's not about the money, it is about the money. Political agendas with an organization such as a Penn State, with many organizations, large and small, there are always political agendas. I'd argue arrogance as well, is that these minors were in great danger for a long period of time, and that shouldn't have been. And perhaps the arrogance that the football program was paramount to the university as opposed to the safety of the minors. And we're not just talking about the personality of the individual at the top, with Joe Paterno or Jamie Dimon. We're talking about the organization itself, as the organization can carry an arrogance to itself. And certainly political agendas extend beyond just one individual. In the case of many of these organizations, it's thousands of individuals.
This case study was invaluable, John, because some of our viewers have asked for a real-life situation rather than a discussion of risk management from an academic point of view. The other value of a case study is the lessons learned. In this situation, what lessons do you take away?
There are some lessons learned, and I think we can all take some stock in that. Is that one thing is that either any one of these factors can be in place and not necessarily lead to a catastrophe of loss of life or a great monetary issue. But when they act together, when there are several of them in place, they often lead to disastrous consequences, as was the case with Bhopal and with Penn State. It's an unspeakable crime, really. It's unfortunate. So working in concert is one. Communication failure is another one. That in many of these instances that Apkowitz goes to in his book, and also when you look at the events that happened in the Gulf Coast with BP, with Penn State, with even what I'm reading about J.P. Morgan Chase, is the communication is an issue.
Well, we began our discussion today, John, by talking about COSO. And it was the Treadway Commission that told us focus on tone at the top. It may not just be the personality of Joe Paterno, but clearly the top leadership does set a tone for the organization, and that tone really affects how the organization approaches risk, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The tone starts at the top, as that expression has been said. There was I had the experience of working for a major organization, and we had an issue that came up, and as a result, there was a communication placed by the CEO, and the CEO created this video. It was a short video, but basically the first sentence of the video said it all, where the CEO said, how we make money is just as important as how much money we make. And then the message after that, it couldn't have been any clearer in those words about acting ethically, raising your hand when there's a problem, and making sure that we're managing our risks effectively.
Well, my own children sometimes accuse me of being too much of a mother. But John, when you remind viewers that risk is unavoidable and that planning should never be shortchanged, you sound just like every parent. I mean, how can we get our colleagues and our organization to take these risk factors seriously?
There should be a recognition within every organization, Becky, that risks can occur, and risks can occur with disastrous consequences. So I think there has to be a recognition that an organization should do something about this. Think big, but start small. And I think by thinking big and starting small, an organization will at least recognize that it's starting, that it's beginning to evaluate the important risks, and it will begin to articulate some type of risk tolerance and risk appetite for the organization. I think once they get through that initial phase, they'll find that actually it was worthwhile, and it's a relatively easy exercise after you get through that initial phase.
Well, you know our viewers, they're already overworked. Even if they had time to become experts in ERM, do they really have the time and energy to measure their organization's risk appetite?
Well, I think finding the time and having the focus on going through the exercise of evaluating risks is a challenge. It's a challenge for many companies. What I would suggest is that if there's a willingness, and there has to be that culture of acceptance to go through this process, is to evaluate getting the executives together, getting their heads together, and determining that, but also utilizing an outsider. You know, often where I'm involved is a company saying, you have no axe to grind. You're perceived to be independent. You're perceived to be objective. And perhaps, you know, there's the benefit of some ignorance with an organization as well in asking maybe the dumb questions, which are actually the question that has to be asked. But there's nothing personal about it. So utilizing a facilitator to get started is, I find it to be very beneficial. At least we've seen that with our clients.
As always, John, you've covered a lot of ground for us this month, from COSO to Joe Paterno. If our viewers could take one thought away from this program, what would you like that to be?
I equate this to being a CPA myself, is taking the CPA exam, is that it seems to be an insurmountable task in trying to get the CPA exam under your belt. But once you get it under your belt, you look back and say, certainly it was valuable, and it was much easier than I thought it would be because I dedicated the time and energy of getting it done. The same thing is true with ERM and creating ERM programs. It's a challenge to get through it initially, particularly the first time. But I have yet to deal with a company that's gone through that exercise that didn't find it very valuable in hindsight and very achievable in hindsight as well.
BDO USA's John McLaughlin, thanks for bringing us up to date.
Oh, thanks for having me, Becky.